Welcome to the Good and Basic podcast. Today with a very special guest, Mr. John-Paul Flintoff. I first became acquainted with Mr. John-Paul Flintoff's work through a book called Through the Eye of a Needle, back when I was doing research into how to make nettles into clothing. And this is a delightful book. It's part autobiographical about a spiritual journey to try to find the meaning of life, and it ends up with you making your own clothes. I think this is kind of going to be the locus of the conversation, but you've also written about public speaking and about performance theater and about how to change the world. And so there's lots of good stuff to talk about today.
Right.
What was this like to write a book about making your own clothes from scratch as a solution to the meaning problem?
It was, well, first of all, hello, thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be asked and very happy to be on a channel that's full of, as we were saying before we pressed record, you pursue a lot of different interests, and I think most human beings do, and the algorithms don't necessarily always reward that, but it's great to meet people who have such wide interests. And as you know, I got a bit lost in the rabbit hole of your channel, looking at different things.
It was so delightful to see that. I believe you watched the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance podcast twice.
I did. Well, I listened to the podcast, and the trouble is, you're both called Joseph, and you call each other Other Joseph. I had no idea who was who, so I couldn't really tell. Not that it matters, but I couldn't tell who preferred which book, so I had to watch it on the YouTube video as well, just so I could get it clear in my head before we met.
Perfect.
Anyway, so it's great to have that eclectic interest, and I'm really pleased to be here. So
that eclectic interest is something that's very important to me personally for the channel. I was afraid when we first started doing a YouTube channel that we would become pigeonholed into an ever narrower focus, and that it wouldn't be as creatively fulfilling anymore. And so it's been important to maintain a little bit of the philosophy side so we can talk about things that matter to us, and also the making stuff from scratch and trying random things like sawdust in pies. So yeah, humans are eclectic. Channels should be too.
I think so. And I find it very encouraging, because I've just started a podcast, and one of the things that put me off was I will be so bored if I have to do a podcast about one thing. Yeah. And so I think it's from seeing that you guys have been doing this, and a few other people in the world maybe as well, that I've got the confidence to believe that it could be a wider magazine. Anyway, you asked me about my book, and I guess that's a similar thing, which is that I didn't want it to be narrow, just about making clothes. And the motivation for the book originally was to try to draw people's attention to issues to do with sustainability and climate change, issues which, quite frankly, put to sleep anyone who isn't already crazy for them. And I found it quite distressing when I first got crazy for those subjects. That's a silly way to put it, but when I first got very worried, I suddenly found myself surrounded by people who are frankly rather depressed. And I realized very quickly, because I'm a journalist by background, that and what I mean by that is that I'm used to sort of telling stories that are meant to appeal to a large number of people. I realized that they were not making much headway. There was a lot of preaching to the choir, and I thought maybe I could write something that's funny. And my first thought was, because I think in this area, let's be perfectly honest, I think there's actually quite a lot of gender stereotypes still in clothes making. My first thought was that it would be quite funny for a person like me. I'm a man who's now 50, but I was younger then, 53 actually I am now, but I'm in my 50s. And I thought it would be quite funny for a man my age to start making his clothes. And there were moments, like when I went into a haberdashery shop, where I asked for stuff and the people in the shop would say, is it for your wife or something? Which really surprised me. Anyway, so I thought it would be quite funny, because if I made my own clothes, it could be a silly adventure, a shaggy dog story. Do you use that phrase?
I think so. Is that the Disney movie?
No, it's a kind of a story that is a bit bonkers and carries on and keeps on adding new bits and being a bit silly. Probably.
Keeps upsetting expectations as you go on.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And then the other thing was...
sorry, on a note on the dialect differences between the UK and the US, When we were over in the UK in 2019 in May, we filmed a series of videos working our way south from Edinburgh, and then we went over to Cornwall and then back to London. But we were very conscious of some of the dialect differences, and so we had a mantra. Every morning we would say trousers, trousers, trousers. And then I think we kept adding new words as we went on. For the most part, we managed to avoid awkwardness, but it
I
was
think
something on the brain.
probably trousers is the main likely sort of center of
Serviette, serviette, serviette. That was another.
Okay, right. Right. What would you call a serviette?
Napkin.
Oh, I would call it a napkin as well. I think there might be
Okay.
a class thing there. I mean, social class, like hierarchy class thing.
Interesting. Okay, so the dialect even is stratified that way.
Yeah, there's that. And then there's also, when I was talking just now, I talked about a haberdashery shop and I thought, should I have said store?
Fortunately, I understand shop, so I think we're
I
on the
thought you
same
might.
page.
I thought you might. So I put the brake on that thought.
Perfect.
Um,
Perfect.
so I was making all these clothes, and the reason why, I mean, you mentioned it was sort of spiritual, and it was really because I started being very down about climate change. It looked pretty bleak. Even talking about it at all, it's very difficult to talk about it in anything other than a bleak way. It's sort of like, I am now going to put a cold blanket over the conversation.
Yeah.
And so I thought, how can I make it different? And I thought I'd do it by trying to be funny. And then once I had this mission, which you've seen many, many times, once you've got some crazy mission to clothe yourself entirely or to make iron or whatever it may be, and even just traveling from Edinburgh to Cornwall, frankly, you have the mission and then you're sort of off. You've got your pretext, your excuse for going. And I had my excuse, and I just noticed how massively empowering it was to make things. Even when I made them wrong, I thought, well, I'm doing it for myself. It's my own choice. I do it wrong, that's great. I'll make it even better next time.
That's incredible. That is so interesting that two things in what you said there. One is that if you have the meaning or the mission, it will just carry you where you want to go. And then that depression that you were talking about seems to just vanish as soon as there's a real sense of purpose behind your actions. And in moments of depression, that's extremely difficult to find. I mean, that's largely part of the problem. But the other thing is, I find a very similar thing. I mean, even with the attempts that have gone spectacularly wrong in making iron, as you mentioned, there's still a lot of satisfaction in it. I actually had I carved a spoon the other day, and
did you?
In total, it took me about 8 hours. I think I have it sitting right here. Just one moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I carved a spoon.
Oh, wow, that's a good spoon.
Thank you. And
it's got a real ladle-like quality. I mean, you could really get a large amount of liquid in that spoon.
I was hoping so. I don't think it'll work at the dinner table quite so well, but hopefully for stirring soups and things.
Yeah.
I was thinking about just the amount of time that went into it, 8 hours, and if I was paying myself a minimum wage to do that and tried to calculate its value that way. And then I thought, that's a little bit ridiculous because I don't pay myself minimum wage to go watch a movie.
No, but quite, yeah. Or to look out the window.
Or to look out the window, right.
I mean, if you had to measure everything by the minimum wage standard, you would never look out of the window. You would never stare at a fire or watch fish in a fish tank or look up at the sky. I mean, it's simply unaffordable.
Yeah.
And really, is life really worth living on that basis? No. I mean, it's a perfectly okay measure, but let's not go crazy and use it for everything.
Yeah.
Well, and in some sense, it's just down to the definition of work, right? I mean, you're not paid to watch a movie because, you don't have to be persuaded to watch a movie. You don't have to be persuaded to look out the window. Well, I mean, I guess sometimes we do have to be persuaded to look out the window because maybe we're not very good at it. But at least in principle, we don't have to be persuaded to look out the window. It's an enjoyable activity, right? I mean, in some sense, the definition of work is this is a Mark Twain line from Tom Sawyer when he gets everyone else to paint the fence for him, right? Work consists of what somebody is obliged to do, and play consists of what you are not obliged to do.
I think that's so true. I've really been thinking a lot about this, and I think this is somewhat at the intersection of all of this, us making things ourselves and the kind of Matthew Crawford, Robert Perek thing. There's something really weird about how the value of an engagement in some sort of enterprise can shift remarkably. In the old days in journalism, you would pay an apprentice, a young person, to come in and do whatever they do. And then it got to the point where people wanted jobs so desperately that they would come in and do it for nothing. And now people are paying to be an apprentice. How? And I just realized you can persuade someone that they ought to pay for it on anything. I mean, really, you must pay for this. And on the other hand, they could probably tell you that you should pay for it, for the great privilege of walking down your street, or whatever else it is, staring out the window. If you make the case well enough, then they go, gosh, yeah, it's really valuable to me. I really want to do that thing and pay for it. So this whole thing about what value is really, really mysterious.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Those are some good examples too. And actually, I'm silent because I'm actually kind of staggered by what you just said, John-Paul, that you can get somebody to pay for anything. And I just need to sit and think about that for a moment, actually, because that seems quite significant. It does seem to hit to the crux of the value question.
It's really interesting to me, haberdashery shops, or I guess we would call them craft stores here in the US, have ridiculously inflated prices here. If you want to buy fabric to sew your own clothes, the cheapest way to do it is actually to buy old clothes or draperies or something that's already been made up into a finished product and then turn that into your new project, because it's so expensive to buy fabric by the yard. And the thing that fascinates me the most about that is that they can still charge that, which means it's no longer economically cheaper to make your own clothes, not by far, unless you're quite creative in where you source your fabric. And yet people are still paying for that privilege because making it is valuable to them, above and beyond whatever the cost of the finished item is.
Yeah, it's because there is so much more value to it than merely the garment. And as I said, I moved from being quite down to being really empowered and feeling full of agency and skilled, and I'd learned these new things. I'd had all this fun. So it really wasn't just about a shirt. The value to me, I can't even begin to remember what I might have spent on any of those things. I mean, hardly anything, actually, because a lot of the time I was getting things, as you said, almost for nothing. My sewing machine cost negligible amounts on eBay. And so in a sense, I wasn't spending a lot, but the value that I got out of it was really amazingly big.
Yeah, and on multiple levels. I mean, there's the garment itself, there's the fact that the garment is custom, and that it has a story, and stories are valuable. I mean, you know this as a journalist and author.
Yeah.
And wearing a story is kind of a cool thing. And in addition to that, there's the impact on the climate and the fact that it wasn't made in some sweatshop in India or Southeast Asia. That is a really remarkable thing.
It made me very happy. And I always wanted to have it be just about discernible that there might be something homemade. Although my wife, I think I said in the book, I did write it quite a while ago, my wife works on a fashion magazine, so she was my person who held me to high standards and said I wasn't allowed to wear things outside the house unless they looked like I might have bought them in a shop, which is a great way of enforcing standards, but it slightly undermined my wish for people to say, gosh, did you make that yourself, in a good way.
Yeah.
So I sometimes would do decorative repairs on what do you call these sweaters?
Yes.
Jumpers? So I would let them get holes in the elbow. I'd be very pleased with that. And then I could do decorative, what a friend of mine calls visible mending. So when you do visible mending, everyone goes, oh, that's nice. There's quite a lot. I mean, I'm sure on various different social media, you can follow the hashtag visible mending, and there's some really beautiful things out there.
I'm going to have to look this up. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. It's also got quite a heritage as an idea. I looked into it, as you can imagine, and there's this Japanese tradition, the name of which I've now gone blank about, but if you have broken pottery, you fill the cracks with gold because it's more beautiful because it's broken and mended. And so I would typically, with these sweaters, I would use as close to golden thread as possible.
What a cool idea to use golden thread.
Yeah.
Citing to that pottery repair technique.
Yeah. It was really delightful. I really regret now that I threw away one of them, but it had got hair thin on in places. I just couldn't carry on wearing it.
Yeah. I patched my very first pair of trousers.
Oh, nice, thank you for
that. About a year ago, I put the first patch on the knee because I'm always wearing through the right knee. When I kneel down to grab things, it's always the right knee that gives out first. But
Right.
I have one pair of trousers which became so thin everywhere, I would have needed to patch the entire garment in order to make it usable again. And so that one has since gone to the dustbin, but the other one still has a patch.
Do you say dustbin or do you normally say trash? But that was for
I
me.
normally say trash. That was for you.
Oh, thank you very much. That was very kind.
Well,
I feel like I ought to say trash, pants, just to kind of restore the balance.
I know we're
balance restored.
bridging the cross-Atlantic divide here. If you don't mind me asking kind of a follow-up question, I'm actually really interested, John-Paul, in the projects that you picked. And you've talked a little bit about, why you started with clothing, because you thought, well, this is kind of a humorous thing. It's a new take on it. Like another one of the projects that you picked was getting rid of your own insects, getting rid of your own insect invasion, if I understand correctly. And
Rats.
Rats. Well.
Excuse me, rats. For the How to Make Everything channel, if I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I believe for him it was a sandwich, wasn't it, Joseph?
Yes, the sandwich that got him started.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of curious. You've talked a little bit about why you started with clothing. Were there other reasons you started with clothing, and like how did you pick the projects? What motivated you? What pulled you? What tipped the balance, or drew your attention to some instead of others?
That's a really lovely question, and I think part of the answer is that. Oh, hello.
One moment. I'm
all right.
Don't report. There we go. Fixed.
Oh, right now. Okay, that's a really interesting question, and part of the answer is that as a journalist, I just cannibalize my life. If I've got rats, I'll write about it, and so that's one part of the answer. But it's not quite enough because I think it's a token of the fact that resourcefulness is an ongoing theme. To kind of use what you've got and don't feel that you haven't got enough, because I always feel like that constraint creates more creativity. Having any kind of constraint suddenly allows me to feel more creative. So if I've only got old brown envelopes to paint on, then that's going to be exciting because I'm going to use white as a highlight instead of just drawing in a dark color. And so constraints are a wonderful thing. And you mentioned that I've written a book about speaking, and that's my latest one. And so I've been thinking again about how much I love writing, and it's really taken me back to this wonderful place where I was as a student when I was studying English, and I thought I would leave university and become a poet. I thought I studied poets, I will become a poet. I didn't realize you don't make any money at all as a poet, so I became a journalist instead. About 3 days into not making any money as a poet. Anyway, the thing is that the resourcefulness is part of it. The loving having a constraint, like I have to do something with this. It's not what I wanted, but I've got this, so I must use this. And that's a lovely way of being okay with how life is, because it would be easy to spend a whole lifetime wishing that we had more or different or other or better or something. But we've only got this, so let's use this. What can we do with it? And I find that an immensely satisfying thought. And I confess that, like everyone else, I don't get to that immediately, but sometimes I get there reasonably quickly.
This is connected to the idea of repair. Like,
yes.
What was the term? The conscious repair, visible repair?
Visible mending. Yes, it's like, this is what I've got, so I'm going to use this. And that's why I wanted to look into nettles, because I thought, what will we wear in England? The climate doesn't allow us to grow cotton, so cotton is a relatively new thing for us. And for millennia, people who lived in this part of the world would have worn nettles. So I got really interested because nettles are this thing that nobody wants. They sting you, they're horrible, and they, you know, nobody wants nettles. But actually, this comes back to that thing about value. When the cotton, if let's say we all mess it up on climate change and sustainability, so we have no more cotton in the UK, then the person with all the nettles is going to be laughing. They'll be charging top pound. See what I did there? Top dollar they'll be charging for this thing that nobody wants. So what I love is this idea that you can by changing the way you look at it, find something really valuable. So this is Joseph F. This is part of it. This is a slow answer to your question, but this idea that we can find something incredibly valuable in what we don't currently esteem is part of my motive. So I don't want to have rats, but it could become valuable because I could write a story about it, and then the paper will pay me, and I'll get, you know, and it'll be interesting, and I'll have this experience. So there is value even in this most unwelcome situation. And then the other thing, that the last bit of the mix is, I think it comes to this idea of improvisation, which is very closely related to what we're talking about, resourcefulness. But I love theatrical improvisation, and I trained with a really top guy in improv. And one of the insights in improv is you take what you're given. It's you accept the offer. So whatever the other person on stage offers you may not be what you wanted, but accept it and use it. It doesn't mean that you have to play liking it. You could play hating it, but you have to play with it.
Yes. Make use of what you're given. I like that a lot. It's the make lemonade out of the lemons you're given.
Exactly.
Sort of aesthetic. And there's something really, really cool. The title of our YouTube channel is Good and Basic, and that's really to highlight that almost everything humans do is a value question. And this idea of mining for value in unexpected places is a really powerful idea, because everything that we consider waste or refuse really is just underappreciated on some level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask Joseph Fisher. I spent a lot of time this afternoon trying desperately to find my copy of Matthew Crawford. The book wasn't published under the same title here, but I did find my Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and it had a bus ticket from 1988. I bet you weren't even born or something. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
That's true. I wasn't.
Right. So there we are. So I read it a long time ago, and since then I still remember there's this bit, I'm sure, and I hope you'll remember. There's this bit where he mends something using the ring on a Coca-Cola can or something.
Yeah, that's correct. The aluminum
that's right.
shim. Yeah.
And there's some debate about whether that's sort of, whether it's on or not. I mean, that's not really on, is it? Some people would say over in England, maybe that's not a phrase you use. That's not acceptable. But I hope you can see how the person who just told you, the person who just told you about resourcefulness, would remember, of all things in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the guy uses a ring pull from a can of soda. That is the thing that's stuck in my mind. I don't know how.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it too. I was going to say the thing that strikes me particularly about that sort of, improv theater connection, and the idea that that constraint engenders creativity. In some sense it inhibits creativity, but more importantly, it allows creativity. Right. I mean, whenever you're given something, you're given a field of options that you can't do, but you're also now given a field of options that you can do.
Yes.
And I was just thinking, yeah, sorry. And this is not connected to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle. Well, I guess it is, but it's not connected to the aluminum shim. I'm still trying to kind of sew that in, if you'll pardon the pun. But when you talk about saving the world, that also seems to be the approach that you've talked about, that I think that other Joseph and I would definitely, sympathize with. That maybe the proper way to save the world is to, as an improv theater, look at what you have been given, and then assume that that is the correct place to begin.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's right. I mean, it's otherwise you're in the field of that joke where someone asks for directions and the person they ask says, well, I wouldn't start from here. I was like, well, then, by all means give me those other directions, but I'm not going to get there, am I? So let's just start from
it's
here.
like that's not helpful. You know, if somebody gives directions to, you know, go from A to B on, you know, geographically, it's like, well, you know, that's only helpful if you're at A. Right?
Yes.
You need instructions that begin where you are. Otherwise, they're not good instructions. They're certainly not good instructions for you.
Can you even imagine trying to memorize directions that were given to you when you knew that the starting point was not where you are? How would you try to internalize that?
It's the most counterintuitive thing when it comes to, like, you know, navigating on roads, but I think it is a trap that we fall into a lot when we think about other problems. And actually now I can bring it back to the aluminum shim, because, you know, there's also an idea here that if you accept that constraint, and if you take that as your starting place, if you say, okay, that is where I am, and this is what I am going to build on, right? And I can go any direction I want with it, but I have to start here. There, like, that actually, I mean, I don't want to get, well, I do want to get metaphysical here, but I'm trying not to be like too speculative about this, but like it, in every at least meaningful sense, it seems to change reality, right? Like it changes the world, it changes the world you live in. It certainly changes the world you see and the world you act in. And maybe it even does, you know, change the world. And so, you know, I'm thinking about that aluminum shim again, and how, like, when you can see those possibilities in those constraints, like, you know, not, I mean, in banal senses too, you actually do change the world.
Yeah. Yes.
Right? Like you create something new.
You seeing the possibilities. I love the Old Show Macgyver. Have you ever seen that old show?
I know of it, and I've heard of it, and I know what you mean. Yeah, I haven't watched much.
No, when I was a teenager, I binge watched all 6 seasons. It might be 7 seasons. But I love the way that the thing that made that show special was the fact that he could perceive in discarded junk what it could be. And I think if you were to live your life that way, just seeing, not you see reality in layers. You see what's there and what could be with a slight bit of effort, and what could be with a slight greater bit of effort. And among all those possibilities, there are really grand things.
Yeah.
And so you would be surrounded by grand things if you could just walk around and see possibilities.
Everything, you're just absolutely swimming in abundance. And the other thing that's, I think, is a consequence of this is that you achieve an extraordinary freedom from the constraint of other people deciding what's valuable. Because there's this classic idea that you buy an expensive toy for a child, and the child's really, really interested in the brown cardboard box that Amazon delivered it in. And that becomes a castle. And the toy that you spent all this money on is nothing. Because the child can do this instinctively. It just sees value in what it wants to see value in. And you know, just as Picasso said that we once were all able to paint like that, but we lose the ability, and only a handful of people can paint like children. We sort of have to work on it, I think, to sustain that ability to see value all around us, and that freedom that comes with it. Because you don't need the thing that someone somewhere says is expensive and necessary.
Yeah.
No, not really.
It's really interesting. I think in clothing, there's a change between this generation and all previous generations, back when clothes were very difficult to make. Because it used to be that finer clothes literally meant finer thread count. And it was a one-to-one, that if your clothes took more time to make, then they were more valuable and more esteemed. And that led to some pretty garish clothing.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I like coarse fabrics. That is a personal preference that I find value in. I like hard-wearing fabric that I don't have to worry that I'm going to muss it up, and I'm not going to worry about tearing it. I want it to be robust enough that I don't worry anymore. And that's something
especially
that
on your pants.
Yes, exactly. Trousers, pants.
Yeah.
Especially with pants. I find that I really, really like heavy fabric for that. And, you know, 120 years ago, 130 years ago, that would have been really low class and awful. But I can say, no, that is actually superior for my needs. And I'm in a position to do that because all the fabric is now so cheap that it is personal preference that drives those decisions now, at least to a greater degree. I mean, there's still a huge social factor, which is difficult to break free of. Label envy and the rest, but it is interesting that we have more of that freedom than we used to.
Yeah, I feel it's quite important just to be really sort of complete and honest about it. That I don't think it would be a good idea to try entirely to escape from those things which I tend to think are bad and toxic, and, you know, labels and what everyone thinks. If I truly didn't care what anyone thought, I would very swiftly die, because I'd be, you know, everyone would shun me. It's important to continue to be a sociable human being and, you know, relatively in the swim of what most people around you are doing, and that's okay. That's why it's really interesting to try and push it a little bit, and to try not to alienate with your experiments and your weirdnesses. And I just want to come back to another thing that I remember, it stuck in my head when you said it, Joseph Fisher, about the constraints, because they can be limiting and unwelcome for such a long time, and then suddenly we can leap through to this moment where we think, no, I can't do anything without a constraint. I really want to. And my current hero in this is the French author Georges Perek, and you may well know this already, but for example, he wrote a whole novel without using the letter E, which is as is important in French as it is in English. So that's an incredibly hard constraint that he set himself. Now, there was a reason for it, which maybe I'll come back to, but I just want to sort of soak in the thought that someone sat down and wrote a fairly fat novel without the letter E. And this is the really beautiful thing. Someone who reviewed it didn't much like it, but didn't notice that there were no E's. And that is so cool. That's just amazing.
I didn't know about the review. That's fantastic.
Isn't it? It's just incredible.
Yeah. That is incredible.
If you don't mind me asking, John-Paul, I'm kind of curious about that example specifically, because one thing you could say about it, well, I mean, there's many things you could say about it, right? But
yes.
I also think about sort of, I'm interested by the way that author, and thank you for telling me about that. I actually did not know about that, but that author chose that constraint.
Yeah.
And I'm interested, like, I mean, what do you think about that? Like, do you think we should do that? Do you think, I don't know. And like, what do you think about that?
I do actually. I confess that I knew about Georges Perec for a long time, and I knew that he'd written that book, and I thought it was a silly stunt, and I didn't want to read it, and I just was not interested. And the more I've found out about him, the more I'm absolutely wowed. And I've fairly recently read twice his biography, which is an entertaining book, but there are reasons why he's like that. And why he was like that. He's no longer with us. His mother was taken to Auschwitz. His father was shot early in the war as a French soldier. And so he missed, as it were, the two most important people, the key figures. So the lack of the most important letter is very poetic.
Oh, wow.
And the book is actually called La Disparition of the Disappearance. And he had a document that was provided to him after the war about La Disparition of his mother. So the disappearance and the missing E, there's a really, really strong emotional reason behind this. But the thing is that I think it's probably fair to say, and I have just read the biography twice, but I might still get it wrong. I think it's fair to say that Perec simply couldn't really write without imposing a constraint. He needed something like that to give him the freedom. It's almost like having utter freedom is incapacitating. Like, where do you start? What are you going to do? Like, why make clothes? You could paint the Sistine Chapel, or you could sort of become a car mechanic. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to have some constraint. And so he found that he was extremely accomplished as a writer. He always wanted to be up there with the greatest writers ever, but he couldn't sort of get himself to do it until he fell in with some people who came up with writing exercises which were inspired by mathematical routines. So he wrote loads of poems with the most incredible complexity. He wrote the longest, oh God, I've forgotten the name of the thing that reads the same backwards.
Ambigram.
Yeah. And so he came up with the longest one. I mean, hundreds of characters long. But if you think about the difficulty, so if I write the name Anna, that's easy because it's reversible. You put one letter in there somewhere and it messes it up both ways. You can't just change it one way, you've got to change it both ways. So imagine writing one that's got hundreds of characters in it. How do you not explode your brain doing that? Somehow his brain was really, really well suited to this idea of verbal constraints. But it's not as if Perek is the only one. Every poet who ever wrote a sonnet found comfort in the structure. It's like, yes, that's right. Yeah, it fits. It works like that. It sort of needs to have that shape. It's necessary in some way.
There's
what Perek would call that sort of like classical quality, the fitting, that harmonious fitting togetherness of the pieces.
Yes.
Yeah.
The fact it does have a sort of metaphysical quality because it's almost like you can't have those thoughts unless they come in 14 lines.
Yeah, well, actually, that was the other example I was thinking of, because in some ways, when you told me about, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name,
Perek.
Perek, who writes this book under this outrageous constraint, and I had kind of a negative reaction to it, which was mitigated by knowing about his past. I actually think that's quite beautiful. But then I also thought, I mean, in some sense, that's just what Shakespeare did, right? I mean, that is what a song, right? You subject yourself to these, fairly arbitrary and fairly constrictive conditions, right? Mm. And then you produce, what we generally regard as some of the finest poetry in the English language, yes. Right? So, I mean, this manifests itself in many ways, right? Like there are these, constraints that you might think are a little ridiculous, but in other ways, there are so many constraints that we put on ourselves that do, that are much lesser, that still do facilitate that creativity, as the sonnet is relative to Perek's writing.
Absolutely. And I would like, because I'd like to hear your answer, I'm just curious, but I'd like to put the challenge on you. There are constraints necessarily in, let's say, having a YouTube channel or having a podcast. And they're sort of invisible because you get used to them and you don't even think about them. But what are those constraints? Because you've experienced those formats, those types of content containers. What are the things that you have done to play around with the constraints? Can you think of any?
I guess certainly the biggest one is, and we alluded to this earlier, right? The fact that we are deliberately eclectic. We do a little bit of a lot, and I know that that's unusual on YouTube. Most channels are much more focused, and even as I've talked to certain other people who have channels, right? They're aware of this, and they're aware of the fact, like, okay, I need to know what videos the viewers are watching, and then make more videos like that, right?
Yeah.
And the consequence of that is that you get caught in this endless feedback loop of you give people what they want and then they want the same thing and then you give them more of it, right? And not that there isn't merit in that, but we've deliberately made the decision to go the other direction, right? And to and some, I mean, there are limitations and constraints there for sure, but we appreciate the creativity and also the ability to bridge over topics, right? Like, I mean, in this conversation alone with you, right? Like we've moved from, sewing your own clothes to metaphysics, to poetry, right? And I'm forgetting a few things that we've talked about, right? And so and that gives us some freedom as well. And that gives us a unique ability to connect things. And that seems to be something that's missing. So I guess, I mean, that's the biggest one that I think of. I also think of the visual constraints, like the fact that YouTube is a visual medium. I mean, it's auditory as well, right? But at least I consider Joseph to be much more, Joseph Bjork to be much more sort of, I'm not sure what the right word is, gifted or interested or experienced with sort of the visual aspect of the medium. And so that's something that I think about a lot, right? Like making videos like makes me think. It incurs cognitive load on me because I don't normally think in terms of video. So that's another constraint, right?
Yeah.
But it's allowed me, I mean, here we are. So, I mean, it allows some things too. I don't know. That's what I'd answer, but I'm curious what other Joseph thinks.
Before other Joseph comes in, I'd just like to point out that Joseph Fisher, you're the one with the camera off.
Yeah. Clearly struggling with the visual medium here.
Yeah.
Well, that's not entirely fair. It is the internet's fault in that case.
Well,
Yeah.
But
okay, so
but it is funny.
go ahead, other Joseph. Let's what do you think about that constraint question relative to
Oh,
YouTube?
it's interesting to me. You mentioned poetry and pursuing being a poet directly after university. And with poetry, there is such a relationship between the form and the content that to harmonize between those two is the thing that makes it really beautiful. That writing a novel without the letter E seems silly until you realize that even that detail is significant to the message itself. Like when you can relate the form and content, it works really well. With YouTube, you've got some limitations from YouTube being YouTube by itself, but YouTube is pretty flexible. You've got access to the visual medium. You could tell a story purely with visuals and it would work. Or you could tell a story purely in audio with just one still frame and narrate an audiobook. There are channels that have put LibriVox audiobooks in video format and they do reasonably well. And you can play with all of these factors. But what I think is more of a constraint is the brand that you create for yourself, because that becomes like a tighter thing. You have poetry, which is quite broad, and then you have the sonnet, which is quite a bit more narrow. And trying to craft a brand that allows you the flexibility you want while still giving enough of a constraint that viewers know what they're coming back for and have a sense of what it is that you're about, that is quite challenging. And it's something that other Joseph and I have discussions about at least, every couple months about where the brand is going and what would be a good and basic video and what would not be a good and basic video and whether something seems to fit or not. And it's been quite interesting collaborating that process because, between our different ideas of what would be a good YouTube video, something is emerging from that and that we're creating a new form, basically.
Yeah. It's like you have to push against the walls around you to know what the space is that you've got. And it's quite fun just prodding that wall and going, oh, look, here I am.
Yeah.
And just to notice it and to keep on asking. And I can imagine why you would. And I suppose this is just like the moments when I've looked at a piece of fabric and, this is clearly more likely to be a pair of jeans than a shirt. And with your very coarse fabric, it would probably make a this kind of thing and not that kind of thing.
Yeah. Where the thing suggests its uses.
Yeah.
One thing that you mentioned a little while back that I would like to bring back is the value of social constraints, like the brand consciousness or the things that people care about. And, it's very easy to become reactionary against everything everyone else is doing and to try to become an island. But there is so much value because other people see things that you don't. And so you can't outsource all of your thinking to other people because that's dangerous, especially if everyone else is doing it at the same time. That could be very, very bad. But
that's what we call a mob.
Yeah.
If you outsource your thinking, bad juju. But it is good to rely at least a little bit on what other people find important because even in my marriage, my wife cares about things that I don't. She is much more aware of people than I am. And so by paying attention to her and paying attention to how much she cares about birthdays and Christmas gifts and these sorts of things, it's helped me to appreciate and see people more clearly than I otherwise could have, given my natural inclinations. I tend to be much more focused on stuff and carving spoons and the like.
Yeah.
But, I mean, she starts worrying about Christmas gifts in January.
Wow. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so important to allow an airing to what's unusual to ourselves, and not to react too quickly with too much anxiety. Just hang on and just let's see. Is this going to be okay? Is it going to be bad? And I really, really passionately feel that it's important to hear things that seem actually even wrong or outrageous, because we need to know that people are thinking those things, and Yeah, there's just a kind of this homogenous thought that kind of travels around. It's got no shape. It's like what lots of people are thinking at the moment, and
Yeah.
I'm not in that mob. But you do sort of need to have a look at it and think about it, and allow your ideas to be tested against it. And I think that's really important. We're social animals, and we want to be with others, and we want to be accepted, but we also don't want, the Groucho Marx thing. Don't want to be part of that club. but we kind of partly do. We do want the club to ask us, and we don't want the club never to pay any attention to what we have to say. It really is. It's a really complicated thing, but it's also not complicated because, like so much else in human life, it's dynamic, so it changes over time. There are moments when everyone's listening to you, and there are moments when you're listening to them, and there are moments when no one's listening to you and you're not listening to them either. And it's okay because it keeps on changing. And I think there's a lovely line in C.S. Lewis, in one of C.S. Lewis's books about Christianity. He talks about the wave of ups and downs, and that's what describes the person. You can't just look at the one up or the one down.
Yeah,
it's really important to accept that these things change.
That tension also makes me think about how we've talked about the value of accepting constraints, and then, well, excuse me, we've talked about sort of two different ways of accepting constraints that seem to be in tension with each other. One is where you go choose your constraint, right? You decide to write a novel only with the letter E. And then we've also talked about how valuable it can be to look for the constraints around you and then use them as a starting place, right? Like in improv theater, you do not choose the constraint, right? Except insofar as you chose to, show up to your improv theater class or your improv theater workshop. But at least within that context, you haven't chosen your constraint. It's given and you have to accept it in order to produce something, right?
Yeah.
That's the right thing to do in that case, right? And I wonder if, there's sort of this meta tension there too, where like similar to what you just described, where sometimes like, is the right thing to do to accept the constraints around you or to go and create a constraint, right? And the answer is, well, it depends, It depends. It's actually not an easy question to solve.
I think it's really good point, and really I remember that because after training with Keith Johnson, I trained lots of other people in improv, and you probably know this idea that everything's an offer and you should always accept the offer. That's the classic thing. You say yes to everything, but that's the beginning of the training, because it's necessary to teach people who are very scared of taking their first steps to be willing to embrace what they're given. Because the classic thing to do is to go on stage and say no to everything and to shut it all down and to keep yourself safe. So saying no keeps you safe, and saying yes gives you adventures. But having adventures feels out of control, and being safe feels boring. Mm-hmm. So we all need to fluctuate between having an adventure and being in control, and being bored and being excited. So we can't. So there's always an ebb and flow about this. Yeah. So if you go on stage as an improviser and you've been told you have to say yes to everything, you'll get really exhausted really quickly. You'll feel overwhelmed, and you'll feel like you have no choice in the matter, and you'll collapse. So you have to be able occasionally to exert a bit of control and say no, but you can do it in different ways. So it's a question of learning how to do that in a way that still seems playful and generous and creative.
Mm-hmm. There's a really cool idea there. If you think about those as kind of setting a spectrum of, and I love the way you said that. If you say no to everything, then you're in control, but everything's boring. And if you say yes to everything, then you're out of control. There is such a thing as too much out of control, and there's such a thing as too much boring.
Yeah.
Some boring is nice. We call that a holiday, but it's very interesting that by doing a little bit of both, you eventually find those boundaries where you cross the line into too much. And that's something that you're constantly having to feel out and use your own, to use Perek's term, sense of quality. And you're figuring out how wide your boundary is. And maybe the boundary changes over time, so you need to constantly recheck it.
I think it's, in my experience, for whatever that's worth, it's become more and more important to check in with myself. How am I feeling about this? Am I enjoying this? Yeah, okay, or no. And so if I can check in on it, then I can adjust accordingly. I mean, also I'm looking at other people too. It's not an entirely selfish thing, but I mean, I think because of the way education in our kind of societies prepares us, everything is intellectual. It's either right or wrong, and you do what you're told. And so there's no class at school, certainly not in the UK, on trusting your intuition, checking your gut instinct, deciding whether you feel like it or not. Nobody teaches that. It doesn't, that's not a thing. So it's something that we have to learn gradually in life. And some of us never do, and some of us maybe learn it earlier than others. But I don't want to be exhausted by saying yes to everything, and I don't want to be bored by saying no to everything. So I have to work out what's my own balance. And there's no sort of great lump of my correct balance. It's a fluid thing that changes all the time.
Yeah, and it's very specific to specific circumstances.
Yeah.
And it's also a thing I would say that sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's something also I would say that you meaning the individual, you meaning me, you meaning all three of us here, seem to know best sort of on an individual level, right? Not that other people can't, help you along, like for instance, an improv training coach, right? But there is this sort of way in which, this is when I asked you, okay, so, which projects did you decide to write about and why? Why those ones? And the answer is, well, it caught my interest, right?
Yeah.
I had the sense that there was something high quality in that direction. And really, I mean, this undergirds a lot of our, democratic institutions and things like that too, right? This idea that, we actually do think that individuals have the capacity, they have the capacity to make wrong decisions as well, right? But they actually do have the capacity to look at their situation, see where they're standing, and then say, okay, quality is in this direction.
Yes.
And I think that's wonderful, right? Like that's an expression of confidence in all of us, in all 7.5 billion of us. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
It might actually be true too, right? Like that's the best part about it.
Yeah. Just if you were going to say something.
I don't remember what it was.
Okay.
That was quite profound. There really seems to be something to that, following your interest, following your conscience. And I think conscience is a word that has become, it's lost a lot of its clout. And I think that's a sad thing, because fundamentally, I think the way that we judge the true, the good, and the beautiful is fundamentally very personal. And the best word I know of for that is conscience. I mean, you can call it trusting your gut, or, here's one thing I did want to mention. I found it. An improv coach is a very interesting kind of teacher, because an improv coach is teaching you fundamentally to trust your gut and to make choices as an individual. I teach at a small liberal arts college, and this year we were talking about Socrates. And the thing that's so interesting to me about Socrates is that his students, if you look one generation past Socrates, they are incredibly diverse. You've got the Platonists and the Cynics, and you've got a couple brands of the Sophists. And what he was teaching was independence of thought. And that led in different places for different people, as opposed to trying to shove everybody through the same mold.
Totally. Yeah. One of the most delightful thing about teaching improv is seeing people doing their own thing, which might seem really weird to someone else, but it's their normal. And you're really, as a teacher of improv, you're basically just trying to get out of the way. That's all. Your job is just, people will think you're the expert, you know what to do. And so you have to keep on dismantling that and allow them to make up their own mind and do their own thing. And so one of the things I would always be telling people is just do your own normal. And so I would say, for example, don't go on stage and try to be original. That's what everyone wants to do. Everyone wants to go on stage and be original. But if I said to you, now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you both to say something to me that's startlingly original, your brain will get into panic and you'll be going, oh no, because I'm effectively saying, say something that you would never say. And that's impossible. So if I then say instead, So I often do that to people, and I can see them looking all anxious and like they're pretending not to be anxious, but their brains are going, oh. And then I'll say, actually, forget that. It's not a good idea. Just say something really just blindingly obvious. And then they'll say something really obvious to each other. And there's this huge amount of laughter and warmth and delight, because your obvious, your normal is not necessarily normal and obvious to anyone else. It's just real and it's fresh and it's honest and it's great, and people like to see it.
There's a lot of value in that, because what that seems to suggest to me is that this collective, everybody thinking thing is much, much, much healthier as people trust their intuitions and trust what it is that they themselves are experiencing. And that seems to actually make the large scale social experience better, like much better.
Yeah. Trust other people to be okay. And then you can be okay yourself, and you can be yourself and assume that they're being themselves. And if it feels a bit weird, then stand back, but that's them and this is you. I once went on stage after a guy who played the flute with his nostrils. That was his normal. I didn't attempt to do that.
I think you would have been a bit disappointed if you picked it up that quickly. You probably took some practice to get that.
Exactly. I would have been gutted if he'd done my thing. I needed to have the space of being the only one who was doing my thing.
Yeah. That's remarkable. There's a quote that my brother-in-law loves, which is that, be yourself, everyone else is taken.
Yeah, that's so right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that relates to this idea that someone told me once, when I started doing lots of workshops and teaching and sort of standing in front of people, which is very different, obviously, from being a journalist and just writing and you never see anyone. You might hear from them, but it's not the same. But standing in front of people, you get this really immediate feedback. And like many people who do that when starting, I was definitely falling into the mistake of worrying about what they think. And someone said to me, don't be in their head, because then there's no one in your head. And I thought that was a really good line. Yeah, I'll be in my head and I'll let them be in their head.
That's fantastic. My mother said something vaguely similar. She said, you don't care what other people think. You care what you think other people think about you.
Yeah, it gets really complicated. The whole tying in knots thing. And you never know what people think anyway. It might be something completely different. So it's very... I drew this graph in my next book, the one about public speaking, and I try to be pseudo-scientific about what makes a good speaker. So it's a graph, and it's got that on the up and down axis on the left is the brilliance of the speech. So high is a really brilliant speech, low is rubbish. And then over here is on the bottom axis is on the left is the speaker trying to please themselves. And on the far right is the speaker trying to please the audience. And it's got a curve, obviously. I mean, this is totally non-scientific, but I thought it would be fun to make it into a graph. It's got a curve because the high point is when you're in the middle of trying to please yourself and trying to please your audience. Yeah. You cannot be just occupying the head of your audience, because then you'd lose all sense of self and you've got nothing to say. But if you're only talking to yourself, then you'll lose any kind of connection with the audience. So there's something really... I really enjoyed making that graph. I don't think I'd seen it anywhere else. Hope I hadn't nicked it.
That's actually quite profound. When I've participated in writing workshops, it's very interesting when you find someone who's written for themselves and they won't accept any feedback because they say, well, I like it that way. And it's good to write for yourself. That's what a journal is for. But if you want to reach someone else, which is really what communication is about, then you need to have something to say and you need to care about it. You need to be invested in it, but you also need to be invested enough in the other person to be able to make that transition between the two. Yeah. And it's a major challenge in writing, I've noticed.
Definitely. I came up with this. Do you have time for me to tell you one other? It's 5 o'clock. So it's whatever it is, 12
Absolutely.
o'clock.
Yes, please.
I came up with this other graph, which actually didn't go into the book, so I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with it, but I found it really satisfying when I was planning this book about public speaking and this whole mystery of how do you have an encounter with other people, you don't know them, how do you develop a sense of who they are, and how can you be yourself? And it's really mysterious. And I came up with this graph, which I called the spectrum of communication. And on the left-hand side, there's a picture of an alien. And on the right-hand side, there's a picture of two people having a candlelit dinner. And the point is, you know that humankind has kind of sent messages into space. We don't know who those aliens are. We don't know what they look like. We don't know what their language is. We know nothing about the people who might receive these messages. So that's a really, really totally 100% broadcast message into the unknown. And then the idea is that over on the other side, you've got very intimate people who know each other very well. They're able to share vulnerability. They're able to share intimate things. So I tried to make to plot on the spectrum what kind of thing belongs where. So like a police officer with a megaphone telling everyone to go home is quite towards the alien end, but you know, they're in the same physical space, so they're a bit to the right. And then where would you have a public announcement that's pre-recorded on a railway? Where's that? Is that before the policeman, or is that on the other side? So I was trying to think this idea of not intimate and intimate, and how do you, what do you do with that? And then it dawned on me that most of the time we're trying to move to the right. We're trying to move not necessarily to a candlelit dinner, but we're trying to get more intimate, more close, more understanding of each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And for that, you have to have just a little bit of knowledge of what the other person cares about, and you need to be paying attention to their responses.
Yeah.
To that end, in this conversation, there's a little bit of knowledge that both of us have about each other's content. I mean,
yeah,
we've read from your books. Most of my background is in Through the Eye of a Needle or Sell Your Own. But Joseph Fisher did a rapid read through the How to Make an Adequate Speech.
Which I have to interject there. It deserves and will get a much deep read, because no, I actually was quite struck by it. We can't talk about it now because there's not really time. But I was quite struck by it. So it deserves and will get a much better read than I gave it.
Oh, great. Well, I mean, if you want to, I'll come back again. And I've really enjoyed talking to you guys. So,
yes, please. That would be marvelous.
Great. Well,
I would. In the future, I can show you a homemade shirt as well.
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll dress up in mine too.
Awesome.
Okay.
I'll turn on my camera.
Oh, yeah. Look what's happened. You see, we've definitely moved a bit to the right on this spectrum. Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing. Yeah. That's so cool.
Sorry, Joseph, you were talking the other book, your exposure to.
Yeah.
So
we're familiar a bit with our content, each other.
Exactly. And so there's a sense that I know a little bit about what you care about, and you know a little bit about what I care about. And so the conversation and what Joseph Fisher cares about. And so there's something to share back and forth.
Yes.
And a little bit of anticipation of how things will be received. And there's context to ask questions from.
Definitely.
It's kind of difficult to ask a question from a megaphone and get anything but a raise of hands.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but as you move closer to the right on that graph, then you're in a position to ask questions and for it to become two-way.
One of the things in improv that is really, really powerful is if you can't think of anything else, just talk about what's actually happening now. And so kind of just observing what happened. And you just did that. And I would add to that we had that moment early on where you sort of, you talked about trousers to make me feel more comfortable. I gave you a few pants back just so that we were, we're kind of getting to, we're sort of reciprocating a bit and trying to understand each other's world. And I think I talked about the education system, and I was very conscious that it is not the same system where you are, but it's probably pretty similar. So trying to think into, and there was that thing where I was worried that I can't remember what it was now, but I was worried that shop. I thought you might not get, and then I thought, of course I get shop.
It's strange. We call them stores, but we go shopping.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah. Odd places where the dialect stays the same.
Yeah. Well, look, I've really had a good time. I don't know how long you planned this to be.
Probably a good time to wrap up. We've been about an hour on the phone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the conversation. It looks like we have at least one follow-up and possibly two, but
Great.
those we will arrange and look forward to on another time.
Definitely.
As
No
always,
hurry. Whenever you're ready, and if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But I've really enjoyed it, and I'd be very happy to receive the invitation.
thank you.
Thank you, John
We
Paul.
would
It's
be
been
very happy
thrilling.
to extend it.
Great. Keep well. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
It's dark out there.
Well, if I point the camera back toward the sky.
Oh, okay. All
Yeah.
right. It's not dark
It's
out
in the
there, but
dark corner.
it's dark out there, though.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, where Joseph is, definitely very dark.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh. Thanks very much, and to our
Thanks.
viewers, see you next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.